Ve lo ricordate quest'uomo in Titanic? Beh, forse tutto quello che sappiamo su di lui potrebbe essere sbagliato. Ciao a tutti ragazzi e bentornati in Curiositanic. Questo penso sia il video più importante mai fatto qui sul canale perché abbiamo un ospite molto importante. Ho avuto infatti l'opportunità di poter ospitare qui su Curiositanic e poter parlare con Simon Matherst, il pronipote del quartiermastro Robert Hichens. Per chi non conoscesse questo nome, Robert Hichens era il quartiermastro che era al timone del Titanic la notte del naufragio. E non viene mai rappresentato molto bene nei film.
Ci sarà un posto in più su questa scialuppa se non ti sbrighi a tapparti quel becco parlante!
Ho voluto parlare con Simon per cercare di capire un po' meglio la storia del suo bisnonno e capire la storia di Robert Hichens prima, durante e dopo il disastro. E sicuramente un diretto discendente può farlo assolutamente meglio di me. E voglio condividere con voi la sua storia che io trovo assolutamente incredibile e affascinante. Questa che vedrete sarà la versione integrale dell'intervista e in lingua originale, ma non vi preoccupate perché potete tranquillamente selezionare i sottotitoli e scegliere la lingua. Credo che ascoltare l'intervista in lingua originale dia tutta un'altra enfasi al suo racconto, ma non preoccupatevi perché sto lavorando su una versione doppiata di questo video, quindi vedrete più avanti la stessa intervista anche in italiano. Prima di iniziare però voglio dare il benvenuto a tutti i nuovissimi iscritti e ricordarvi di attivare la campanellina e se non l'avete fatto di iscrivervi al canale perché Simon sarà solamente il primo di tantissimi altri ospiti che avremo qui su Curiositanic. Quindi senza perdere altro tempo vi presento il signor Simon Matherst. So Simon, welcome. I'm so excited and thrilled to talk to you and thank you for giving the Italian audience the opportunity of talking to you and hear your story, which I think it's something amazing about your great grandfather, about
Mm.
Titanic, and how all this affected you and everything. So I'll say let's start by telling people who Simon Medhurst is.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's a real privilege to be given this opportunity. To be honest, obviously I was born in London, so I have a bit of a London accent. So I apologise for that. Usually, Londoners miss the H's, so if you miss any H's, you'll understand why.
Yeah.
And so I moved to Essex, and that's where I live now. Yeah, so I was born in 1968. That gives my age away. I have a picture. If I show you some pictures, that might actually help with understanding the story as well. So this is a picture that I have. I've tried to bring it. Hopefully, you'll be able to see all these. So that's a picture of my what I was told my real nan. So
Okay.
that's my real nan, and that's a picture of me as a baby. So that's black and white. That gives it away. Yeah, so that's my grandmother, and I was just told that yeah, she's your real nan. So I didn't know who my birth father was. So I grew up with my mum, and I suppose he'd be my class as stepdad, but I always known him as daddy, and he's always been my dad, and always will be. But then in 2012, I found my birth father, and at that point, he then said to me, "This is my birth father." Said to me, "I took that photo. That's my mum, and that's Robert Hitchens' daughter." So all of a sudden, things are sort of getting a bit strange because from my early 20s, I'd been collecting Titanic memorabilia. Not as many models as you have, but I have had models. I had books. I was collecting signatures and all those sort of things that we all enjoy as Titanoracks. We just sort of hoover up anything that we can find to do with Titanic, and so that was in my early 20s. So this is why I found my birth father when I was 45. So it's lots of years later, and then all of a sudden, I'm not just a collector of Titanic memorabilia. I'm actually related to someone on Titanic. So then I'm sort of thinking, okay. So I knew obviously the basics, Captain Smith, Lightoller. So who was Robert Hitchens? So obviously then that's finding out, and then realise not only is it somebody on Titanic, but it's actually the man that was at the helm when it hit the iceberg. So all of a sudden, I'm related to someone who's right in the centre of the story. And so for me, it was a big thing, because then I've gone from just somebody who enjoys it all to actually being related to someone. And the signatures that I was collecting, some of them weren't as close a relative as I was, so it all became a bit strange and a bit odd. So this is a picture of my birth father, so just so you can see, and that was not long after we met. So so that's it. And then I'm looking at it, and I'm direct relative of Robert Hitchens, which, if I show this picture, it probably gives everybody an idea of who he is. So that's Lifeboat 6, and Robert Hitchens is the one right at the back. Yeah, right at the back here at the tiller. And you've got Fred Fleet right at the front, and on there is, obviously, as we know, Margaret Brown, Molly Brown, which is known sort of in Lifeboat 6, and this is another one of Lifeboat 6, actually. And there's Robert at the back there. So so it's it became a very, very strange and an odd sort of turn and twist in my life, you know.
I think it's crazy that you started collecting objects and memorabilia from Titanic. You had
I
no
had
idea
no
that you
idea.
were connected.
Yeah, and I had no idea. And then I found my birth father in 2012, which was even more weird, which was exactly 100 years.
Wow.
You know, so it was a very, very strange journey. You know, finding my birth father to start with, and then finding out, great. I mean, that was hard enough as it was to, that was an experience in my life I wasn't expecting, and then to find out that he was the grandson of, and now I'm the great grandson of. So it then dropped to me to carry on the legacy and to do what I can to. I think the more I learned about Robert, the more I felt that it was right to do more, because Robert's name was given it has over the years been given quite a bad.
Yeah, we'll be talking
Bad.
about that. Yeah.
Yeah, hope we get on a bit that. So that's that's where we are, really. So it's all been a very wild experience for the last few years now.
It's so interesting that sometimes DNA and something like that, it's so weird. Sometimes I feel that I kind of have connection with Titanic myself. I don't know, maybe in another life or something, but I feel sometimes like it's my own ship.
Yeah.
So knowing that someone started collecting stuff, not knowing that he had some sort of connection with Titanic, some such as deep connection like that, it's crazy. And how, how did your life kind of change when you?
To be honest, it literally did change. I think because I had a love for things Titanic. I like history, so I enjoyed the story of Titanic, and I enjoyed that. But when you become a relative, or you realise you're a relative, the whole aspect changes, because people's attitude changes as well, which is a strange one, because people want to know the story. They want to know, it's it did become very strange, because people want to know more, whereas if you're not connected, they don't. It's not that same. People want to hear the story. They want you to be there to talk about it and what have you. So, whereas before, I'm quite a shy person, quite a recluse. Really, I'm not really a sort of a at the front person, to be honest. So having people say, "Oh, you come and do I don't know, after dinner talk," or "Will you come and do this?" or "Will you come and do that?" and it's like, "Oh, okay, I'll do it." I think it's been stranger for my wife, to be honest. I think she's. But so it's been a great journey, I'll be honest, because it's allowed me to spread the story of Titanic, and I have a real desire for the younger generation, which is just younger than me, basically. So to actually get a grasp, and I said to you earlier, wasn't it, the fact that once you have Titanic, Titanic has you, and it's sort of a story that grabs everybody in different ways. As you say, it can be because they're interested in the rivets in it. There's those that are interested in you know, all those sort of things, the dimensions, and then there's those who want to know more about the people, more about the stories, and I probably am more connected to that purely because I've looked more into Robert and the life and those sort of things, which then does steer you into the others as well, which is later on was mentioned in the book, but that's partly that as well.
And how were you able to find more information about him? Like, were you told about your grandmother or
No,
relatives or?
basically, there's another great granddaughter called Sally Nelson. She actually wrote a book about Robert Hitchens. So she did it around about the same sort of time I found out. She put this book together, which was really about the life of Robert Hitchens,
Mhm.
which to me was like my foundation really to understand more about Robert. And then it's just going into records, going into research to find out what ships he was on, you know, before Titanic, after Titanic, find a bit more about his life. There's not really many relatives that are available for talking about Robert. So there's not really any relatives as such. So it is researching what's there already.
Mhm.
Even my dad wasn't wasn't interested in Titanic. It's not the right word, but his sister was. She was the one who did all the research, but she died just before he found me. So it meant that it all stopped at that point. And then when my birth father found me and I found him, he said basically you need to take over from where my sister left off and just carry it on. So that's really what I've done really. So yeah, it's thankfully we have the internet and that's
Yeah,
fantastic. I don't know what anybody would do with that, to be honest.
yeah.
So yeah, that does give you a lot of help. It is again being careful to sift what's been said and what's actually been said.
I talk to my subscribers a lot, especially during lives, and I always say that never stop at the first information you read, but
Yeah,
always try to cross
yeah,
information and see
yeah,
where the truth lies. Because, you know, testimonies can be tricky because some people
mm,
might not recollect or remember
yes,
some facts, some timing, some names,
absolutely,
or
yes,
people can make up stuff.
yes, absolutely, absolutely,
So a, a person's reputation can be, you know, screwed
yeah,
if a person just like makes up stuff. And I think it's a little bit the case of your great grandfather because
yes,
I knew his story from the movie at the beginning,
mm,
and I've
yes,
learned a little more about him through books. And
yes,
I think he was very professional, and he did what was the best to do
yes,
for the
yeah,
people in the lifeboats. Going
yeah,
back in that situation would have been suicide, and he's been
yes,
criticized for that. And I
mm,
think people need to get in his shoes, get in the same situation in the middle of North
yes,
Atlantic
yeah,
in pitch black. It's not a situation you want to be in, you know?
no,
So I think he did a really good job, even though um, there was some, I think he was a really, really tough person to deal
mm,
with.
yeah,
He was a sailor, you know, so
yes,
he had to
absolutely,
be.
yes,
So
absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a story that I've looked into this sort of over and over again, and I've come to the conclusion that Robert wasn't perfect. Find me one who is. Um,
exactly.
but the fact was that he did do exactly as you say. He did exactly what he was asked to do. You know, it wasn't his choice where he went with the steering wheel, if you like. You know, it wasn't. It was the blinds were drawn. There was nothing to see. It's not like driving a car or even flying a plane where you look out the front screen. There was nothing to see. All he did was literally steer according to the compass, and according to the orders that he was given, and that's as simple as that. So there's no variation there. And then he was asked to unload a lifeboat. Then he was asked to go into a lifeboat. He wasn't asked to fill the lifeboat. That was the officer's job, not Robert's job. Because very often, so there was only 20 odd in his lifeboat. But it wasn't Robert's job to fill the lifeboat. He was just in charge of it. And so, I think then, the order to go and go towards the light and then come back after you've done that to pick up other survivors. Once you've done that, come back and pick more people up. So he did exactly what he was asked to do. Interestingly, I spoke to David Haseman, who's the son of Edith Haseman, and he was a quartermaster himself, which was quite fascinating because he said to me, there are certain things that as a quartermaster, you had to make sure of, that once your lifeboat left the ship, you had to make sure you got away as fast as you could away from the ship, because there were going to be debris thrown off, because everybody's going to throw deck chairs off everywhere. Everything's going to be thrown off for obviously for floating on or whatever it could be. So you made sure your lifeboat was well away from that, and also things like suction of the ship. There was lots of things and also being swamped by those in the water. So you had to be away from the ship. So I think, say, Robert did everything that he was asked to do, and he even let people attempt to tiller the lifeboat, but it clearly was just going around in circles. So, he just had to take control of that. And I think the whole journey, he had to take command. That was his job.
Yeah.
And he made sure he was the last one off the lifeboat when it arrived at Carpathia around about 8 o'clock in the morning. So, he did everything that he was asked to do.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of misinformation about what happened on the lifeboat because from the movie, especially from the extended version,
Yeah,
believe
I
it's
find that really irritating. I'm not saying it more, but really irritating.
exactly. You hear this conversation, this kind of a fight between him
Yeah,
and Molly Brown. But that actually happened in another boat because it
yeah,
happened in Lifeboat 8, and it was
yeah,
actually a sailor who told
yes,
Thomas Jones, who was the
yeah,
killer, to shut that hole in your face. It wasn't
yeah,
you and
absolutely.
Hitchens. And it was Molly Brown who told your grandfather or something like that
Yeah,
she's gonna throw him overboard. So
yeah,
that's what at least what Molly Brown said.
yeah. I mean, I think it's yeah. I think with the film, ideally, if what James Cameron should have done is done a generic lifeboat.
Mhm.
He could have potentially put more into that if he wanted to, which could have involved more lifeboats. That was, if he'd made it a generic lifeboat, he could have put conversations from lots of different lifeboats into that lifeboat, and no one really would have been too hard on him. But I think the fact that he deliberately went for Lifeboat 6 and then put things that were never said in Lifeboat 6 was a real pity. And I feel that's one thing that sort of grates on me every time, really, because that's what they see Rock Hitchens, as you say. That's the only thing they get.
Let's go back because I want to talk about something interesting that
Okay.
it's kind of been mm, it's been out there in Italy, especially in books and whatever, and different authors. But I think it's about time that we debunk this information. So let's just say we go back to the night of the sinking, the moments before the collision. So let's say around 11:35-ish. So like 4 minutes before the impact. What was your great grandfather doing? I mean, he was a quartermaster. What is a quartermaster? And what was he doing on the bridge?
Yeah, I mean, he was given lots of different jobs. I mean, he came on duty at 8 o'clock. I was trying to get no, my mind's gone blank now. So he came on duty at 8, and then he was trying to think 10 o'clock. It's 10 o'clock, 10 to 12. Yeah, so he came on at 8. And then he would just stand by and really keep an eye on the other quartermaster who was at the wheel, and
Oliver.
then it took over at 10 o'clock, and then he would do his 2 hour stint till 12 o'clock. That's really his duty. Obviously, he would go off to temperature of the water. It could be any other little jobs that he might be asked to do, but his main duty was just to keep an eye on the other quartermaster, that he was following the compass and anything else that he might have been asked to do by the captain or an officer, and that sort of thing as a quartermaster. So yeah, that's what his job was. So of course he came to the wheel at 10 o'clock, and that's his main duty, was to just keep an eye on the compass and
He was
follow
pretty
orders.
much steering the ship.
Yes, yeah, full on steering the ship, but it wasn't. You are very. I imagine it was Madge very much. That's it. I can't imagine there's an awful lot of. It's not going to be sort of like doing all sorts
Yeah.
of like a steering around a car sort of thing.
Just to be clear with people that might not know how Titanic was built, the actual bridge, it's not the one right on front. That's the
Oh, that's-
navigation bridge.
Yeah,
It's used
yeah, that's
when
right.
they got close to shore.
Yep,
The actual bridge it's more inner, it's more
yes,
on inside, and it's pretty much
yeah,
all closed from the elements, the
yes,
cold, whatever. So he was pretty much following orders without
yes,
looking at what he was
yeah,
doing, pretty much.
yeah. All the blinds were down. As it's all that at night, all the blinds were brought down, so there's literally nothing to see. So the light's very low, and there's nothing to see. You can't see out. There's no visual anything.
And that's what I wanted to talk about, because he was at the helm,
Yeah,
and three bells are heard. That meant something's wrong right
yeah,
ahead.
right ahead. Yeah.
Marduk tells hard to starboard,
Hmm.
and he turns the wheel hard to starboard. And that's where kind of the misinformation
Yeah.
starts, because some people claim that Hitchens steered the wrong way because he kind of like probably misheard the order or whatever. But mm, people might not know that back then they used tiller commands. So or
Yes.
harder starboard actually meant hard.
Turns the ship left and not
Exactly. It
right.
was pretty much, in,
Even though you're turning it right, it's actually going left.
and there was always another quartermaster on his side, Oliver,
Yes.
in his
Yes.
case, that confirmed the
Yeah, everything was confirmed. Nothing was done. You were never left to just do what you want.
exactly. You'll always double check.
And also, harder starboard is very different from port. So, and I think I do believe he went harder starboard, then he went harder port, which would steer it round the iceberg. Which
That's
I
what
think
Mark-
is why.
That's what Boxall
Yes.
said he heard, that Mark
Yes.
was telling the captain that he port the ship so it would not like glide against
Yes,
the
all the way down. It would have gone if he hadn't have done the harder starboard, harder port, then it would have ripped all the way down, probably down to the propeller.
yeah, it would have capsized.
Yeah, taken the whole side out, and literally would have been over in minutes rather than hours, or less than that even maybe. But it just the fact was that that was. I think that's very much what it was. And as you say, with the telecommands, and nothing changed with those telecommands till a little later.
I think in the 30s.
Yes, so it was never an issue at that point. So it was quite normal. I think the theory came. I'll be honest. I think it came from Lightotter's
great
granddaughter or something.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Which I do believe that most historians, if not all notable historians, would say that was the right answer. That it was not a mistake.
Exactly.
That everything was perfectly as it should be, because you can't hide that kind of mistake.
No.
It's not going to,
And as far as I read, correct me if I'm wrong, I read somewhere that Marduk had the tendency of like catching the helm if someone was doing something wrong. I think he did it on another ship.
Right. Okay. That I don't know, but you know, you've got officers in that bridge. You've got people in that bridge who would have heard what was called, and you know, there's no way that they're going to just allow something to be done wrong. You know, it's just not going to happen. You
Yeah,
know, it's
because
just
I mean they always double check the order.
yeah,
If
everything's done.
you stop the engines, there's always gonna be another officer said
Yes.
engine stopped.
Yes.
All
Absolutely.
the no order on a ship or anywhere,
No.
it's gonna be done without double checking. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And you know, I think it would have been. I do believe it would have been found out if that had been the case, because they would have been quite. I think they. I'll be honest. I think the inquiry would have been quite happy to have had a scapegoat.
yeah.
So if they could say, "Oh, Robert turned it the wrong way," that would give the scapegoat.
And I
Um,
think that's what they always try to do. They always try to find a scapegoat, even in
yes.
this May case, you know.
Yeah.
Captain Smith was dead, so
Mm.
Thomas Andrew
Actually, if
died.
you, if you look at the inquiry, though, Robert Hitchens, the only thing that really they tried a little bit on was when his behaviour in the lifeboat,
Hmm.
which actually he actually then at the end of the inquiry said, "Look, do you think I could say a few things because I want to put my story right?" So he actually goes back and says what actually happened in the lifeboat that night, because he felt that he was being treated a little bit harshly. You know, oh, he was drinking, oh, he did this, did that, the other. When actually he'd said, you know, exactly what happened. You know, he had no hat on. He was given a half wet, half dry, half wet blanket just because he was standing. He was at the back, in you know, with no fully exposed to the elements, and also he was given a spoonful of, I think, of whiskey or something just to warm him up. But literally, that was it. There was no sort of like drunk or sort of really bad behaviour. He did his best under the circumstances, like probably we all would.
Yeah, I think it's just a problem that someone with a strong attitude might mislead people into believing that he was probably doing something wrong. Plus, they haven't been sleeping all night. The stress,
Yeah,
the fear. There's a lot of, things that go into when something happens. So it's really,
absolutely.
yeah, and it's so
I
hard.
mean, I'll put my hand up if there was something that I felt Robert shouldn't have done or should have done. I would put my hand up and say that Robert should have done this or should have done the other. But I do feel that there's been a lot of weight put on Robert unnecessarily. You
Mhm.
know, because he wasn't perfect. I understand that he was a rough seaman, but he was at the top of his game. You know, he'd been a quartermaster for 7 years. You know, how he got that position on Titanic, I don't particularly know. It doesn't really sort of say why he particularly got that position, but he did, and clearly his credentials
We're
were
good.
high enough
Yeah.
to get him that kind of position with six others, you know, or five others. You know, it's sort of, it was quite an honour, I feel, for him
You
probably.
would not get a job on Titanic if you were not good in what you did. So,
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
even when they talk about the, Harold Bright and Jack Phillips,
Mm.
that they
Yeah.
didn't bring the ice warning to the captain. It's all wrong because it's
It wasn't. It
probably the
wasn't
mistake
supposed
from the
to.
other ships that they didn't put
Yes.
MSG.
Yes.
So it's always someone to blame, you know?
Yeah.
Is it probably it was just
That is probably
bad
the
luck.
story of Titanic, isn't it? Though that is the story of Titanic. That there are so many twists and turns
Yeah.
in the story, and that's what fascinates us because we can talk about these things,
Yeah.
and
And
it does fascinate us.
it's so frustrating when I do my live stream and I tell what people saw with
Yeah.
their own words, and sometimes people are like, "Oh, you were not there." Yeah,
Mm.
but they were.
Yes.
And Titanic's going to disappear in years. We
Yes.
probably won't be here to see it, but I think the job of a good historian or enthusiast or whoever is involved into the Titanic story
Yes.
is to pass it on to people
Yes.
because
Absolutely.
there's no survivors left. There's no one who's going to be able to tell the story but us that
Mm.
we studied it, you know?
Yes.
So sometimes it's just, I think it's people need to just like shut up and listen.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
I think the problem is that also people enjoy a conspiracy theory, and we're not into conspiracy
no.
theories. We want fact. We want,
Yeah.
you know, that we want to have the story from the right angle because it should be history,
hmm
and
And
we
it's
don't
all
want
laid
to. It
down. We
needs
all,
to be fanciful. Doesn't need. There's enough in that story for it not to be fanciful. Um,
it's something that I always say. Titanic is so fascinating that doesn't need anything
yeah.
more to
Yeah.
sell books, you know? It
Yeah.
does, you don't need to write a book about how a fire sunk the
Yes.
Titanic or how the switch theory or whatever, because I think the story of the biggest ship in the world going down on its maiden voyage with
Mm.
the CEO of the White Star Line, the captain, some of the richest people in the world.
Yes.
It's so fascinating. There's no other ship that gives
Mhm.
us this, you know? So,
Absolutely.
but there's always people who are going to make money out of it, and the only
Mm.
way to sell more books is to make up stuff.
Yeah. And very often, the people who make up the stuff are not actually historians.
Exactly.
Very often, they might be journalists
hmm
and things
People
like that.
tend to
Where
believe them. That's the problem.
yeah, and so if they say things long enough, people will believe it. You know, people will use I don't know, for instance, the fire like you mentioned, and they show these pictures of this scorch mark
That wasn't
on
even on the
Titanic.
right spot.
Yeah, not on the right spot. Plus, if you actually know, there's actually I think there's 3 or 4 pictures of the same thing, and they always use just the 2 or the 3 that have got
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
and miss out the one that doesn't have it at all.
Yeah.
And you think, well, why have they just left one picture out that hasn't got it, and but they put it one with the other ones? And there's a jetty that's just off to the side, which is quite clearly the reflection of this on the ship.
Yeah. I know.
And then you think, what is that all about? People will believe that. Don't believe it.
No.
You
I
know?
made I made an hour and a half long video about it,
Yes.
debunking
Yes.
entirely
Yes.
this fire thing. And people are still gonna believe journalists instead of believing me that
Yeah.
I provide them with documents, you know?
Yeah.
It's just people are going to be people. Same
Yeah.
thing in 1912, same thing in 2025.
I mean, I found it interesting because I think you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but apparently they shoveled the coal that was on fire, for instance, and they shoveled to the other side of the ship,
They saved the ship.
which actually meant the ship probably lasted longer
Yeah, it didn't
because of
capsize because they had
distribution.
two and a
Yeah.
half degrees angle
Yes.
at
Yeah.
least on the other
Yeah.
side.
So in some senses, this coal fire that brought down Titanic actually probably saved lives.
Yeah, it's called the guardian angel theory.
Yes. Right. Okay.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because I've been
Yeah.
talking about it on my YouTube channel and how the bad guy turns
Yes.
into the good guy who actually saved lives. So,
Mm.
but
It's fascinating, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah. So correct me if I'm wrong, because I think I read this on a Sea of Glass as well. Probably you know better than I do. Always with Molly Brown involved, because once they got on the Carpathia, she said that she got into this room and Hitchens was talking to this crowd of people, bragging about his actions. And as soon as he saw Molly Brown, he like walked away. But I read about Molly Brown, and she had the tendency of making up stuff. Like for example, when the ship collided with the iceberg, she said that the impact was so strong that she rolled over. She fell
Yeah.
from the bed,
Yeah.
which probably didn't happen. So
No.
Do you think that really happened, or do you have more info about that?
I don't actually know. I don't really know much about it, to be honest. I think, I mean, I've no doubt they were all talking.
Hmm.
I'm no doubt they all were talking what happened. You know, what did you do? What? You know, there was probably this big conversation of what was going on. Whether Margaret Brown would have gone anywhere near where any of the sailors were, particularly because being first class, would she have mixed with anybody else but first class?
Mm.
Don't know. I mean, I imagine that they were given a place specifically set aside for first class passengers. I would imagine.
I
As soon
know
as
that
they
she
found
was
out,
going back and forth because she spoke more languages, so she was like helping.
yeah.
So she probably
So
she went
maybe.
all
Well, I
over.
mean, I don't want to knock her either because I think actually um, we will never know. I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. But
And
there's one quote about your great grandfather that I love. It's when he said, "Why she had to get into my lifeboat."
yes, yeah, it's interesting because I mean, you'll probably come back to this a little later about the book, but I actually got some forwards for the book,
Hmm.
and one of them I managed to get Helen Bessinger, who was the great granddaughter of Molly Brown. So I was able to get her to do one of the forwards for the book, which I thought was quite sweet, really, because we've been friends for quite a while. Hopefully, one day we'll have a Lifeboat Six reunion or something.
That's nice.
Um, but she did actually write um, about Robert in Lifeboat Six, and I'm trying to find a bit right. So she says here, uh, was Quartermaster Hitchens wrong? No. When Hitchens was given command of Lifeboat Six, he was given charge of the safety of the lives in that boat. They and only they were his sole responsibility. Lifeboat Six left early, and there were not many in the water at that time. I am sure that had there been more people near the lifeboat, as anyone would, he would have rescued them. They are they were too far out for that to be the case. Had he gone back to the ship, would they have been able to save more lives? Perhaps, but he would most certainly have been putting those in his charge at risk. And he says many people that night had to make very hard decisions. I would ask that we all understand that none of us really know how we would react in the same horrific situation. And she basically says Robert did what he did at his time. Would it have been something that she would do? She doesn't know, you know. And I think that's it. And that's speaking about her own, you know, her situation as being the great granddaughter of Molly Brown. You know,
Yeah,
and she could say, you know, was Robert wrong? No, he just did what he did at the right time.
exactly.
It's
That's
not
what
sort
I
of going to say,
think.
Robert, you should have done. You know, it's you know, we don't know, do we?
Yeah, I think it's as we said, it's such a hard, difficult situation to be in that it's hard to pass judgment on people and their action and everything. So, mm,
I mean, some of them wouldn't have even known that Titanic was actually sinking as such. You know, a lot of these people were told to get in the lifeboats, okay, just go out for a little while, and in a little while you'll come back. So it
yeah,
wasn't as if everybody was screaming. The first ones, anyway, were screaming, thinking the ship's sinking, the ship's
yeah.
sinking.
Panic
So
arrived around 2 o'clock, so it's like 20 minutes
yeah,
before the end, and even then, a lot of people didn't want to get into lifeboats because they thought they were unsafe.
yeah, yeah. I think there's a lot of situations not having proper drills, um, just certain things that maybe could have been a lot better.
Yeah.
Having more lifeboats would have been a lot better, of course. Um,
I think in a way, Lightoller had a worse attitude that Itchen had.
right, I'm glad you said that because that's one thing that I felt along for a long time actually because you know Murdoch wasn't there to see the end, you know, but he was definitely letting people in. You know, it was women and children first, then men could get in after.
Yeah.
And Lightoller was just women and children. That's it. No men are getting in, whether there was room or not. you know.
Yeah,
So
he didn't even let in the Titanic orphan's father.
yeah,
This man brought these two babies into a
yeah,
lifeboat.
mm,
They were in, and he told him to get out. I mean, I think it's crazy to me. I mean,
yeah.
a situation like that, and yeah, yet a lot of people talk about Hitchens and don't talk about Lighthauler. I think that's a little unfair.
Yeah, I think when you think Robert's boat had about 23 or something in it, or around about that sort of size, and could have taken what 60, 70, you know, and they didn't know that. I mean, a lot of them were worried that if they loaded them full on the davits, that the boat would snap in half,
Yeah. There's a
and they,
difference between loading capacity and floating
yeah,
capacity. So they were actually trying to fill the
yeah,
boats after.
yeah,
It's
yes. So
so
it's
complicated. So
yeah,
many factors get
yeah.
involved.
And then you've got obviously the list of the ship, which meant some of the lifeboats were hanging away from the ship. Some were
Yeah.
against the ship and had to be pushed away. And
Yeah.
there's just lots of stories. There's just lots of things to grapple with in the story, you know, and the chaos.
Yeah. What can you tell us about your great grandfather after Titanic? I mean, what happened to him? His life after? What happened?
Well, it's interesting because I went. So this is just my handwriting. It's like a whole list of stuff. I won't show you all because it's just chaotic. But it's basically what I did was I looked up Robert Hitchens and I thought, right, I want to know what he did after. What was his journey after Titanic, and it was immense. Because basically I thought, you know, he'll be on Titanic. Okay, he comes off Titanic, he'll get on another ship, and then he'll just stay on that ship. But he didn't. He basically would go from one ship to somewhere, get on another ship, go to somewhere else, and he would be backwards and forwards. You know, so he was obviously in 1912 he was a quartermaster. He was 29 on Titanic there, but then he went on to HMHS Sudan, which was a P&O navigation company. He then went on to the Rubin. He went on to the Nora James. He went on to the Caledonia, the Nessian, and he just went on and on and on over the years of different ships, the Magpie, the Homeric, um, Orticlus, and Phineas. It just goes on. Where he was a second mate, he was a quartermaster. So he carried on. He carried on. He never went on another big like ship like Titanic, but so he was more cargo ships, different ships that he would have travelled on. And then it wasn't till probably, well, it was in the early part of the 30s that he stopped all that and decided he would do something completely different, which was to actually have his own vessel that he could, small vessel that he could do tours around sort of Devon area. So he bought a little boat called the Queen Mary in the 30s, which wasn't as big as a Queen Mary. It was just a small little ship, little boat, really, I suppose you would call it. So his idea was to give him tours around the harbour and this, that, and the other. So he bought this, but sadly, he'd bought half of the ship and then paid the other half, or got the other half from a loan from someone. Then I think you're looking at the early 30s, the thought of war, the thought of depression. There's not much money about. Nobody wants to go on tours on water anymore, and it all becomes a bit hazardous for Robert because he now can't pay the loan back, and obviously then the half owner of the ship decides, right, I'm just gonna take the ship back from you. I'm gonna possess it back. So it means that Robert loses everything. And at that point, he's got nothing. He's got no job. He also has what is called, I suppose, a chronic fatigue syndrome. So he's got lots of depression. He's got lots of difficulties, which means he goes into drink. And at that point, he decides, you know, his wife and children then go back to Southampton, leaving him in that part of the Torquay area, trying to find work, can't find work, and then decides that in the end he's going to end it all and decides he'll go and shoot this man and then end his own life. And that's really where he went to. He purchased a gun, went to get this Henley guy, and was so drunk that he actually, when he opened the door, he went to shoot him and missed him, or just clipped his ear. It sounds a bit like Donald Trump, doesn't it? But anyway, so he sort of clipped his ear, and then then he got a right hook from Henley, and then he tried to shoot himself and missed. So it was a really sad story, really, and then of course he was done for attempted murder, and then went to end up in the Isle of Wight, and he got 5 years, which isn't a lot because he for that attempted murder potentially could have been a lot longer, but he realised that, and I think the judge, as far as I can gather, the judge saw his good behaviour, and so actually he was given a lighter sentence because of Titanic, because of his general behaviour and things like that. So, and then of course he then came out of prison in actually about 1938. I actually have a couple of his prison letters as well, which is fascinating, that he wrote in prison and sent out. I have a couple of those letters, which is all his handwriting, and it's quite fascinating.
There's
So
a
yes,
lot of, there's a lot of PTS
yes,
going
absolutely.
on, and I think it's kind of like what happened to Fleet, because
Yes, exactly.
there's a survivor on the Carpathia that heard Fleet said, "Oh, they're gonna blame me because
Mm,
I didn't see the iceberg."
mm.
So I think a lot of people, and when you hear about the stress that these people went through, I think they had to deal with it for the rest of their lives. So,
There
and
was no help whatsoever, and generally a lot of them just went to drink.
yeah,
It did. A lot of them went to drink. Interestingly, while he was in prison on the Isle of Wight, my grandfather went to the Isle of Wight to ask for my grandmother's hand in marriage because I think she was only 18 at the time, and so he had to go there, which is fascinating as well. So it just sort of brings the story to life. Then you realise that they've had to go to the Isle of Wight and ask his permission while he's in prison for their marriage.
wow,
Um,
what a story.
so, and then of course they get married, have my father, and then that's it. Story goes on.
Wow. So,
And also, my grandmother was born in 1913. So, if Robert hadn't survived, none of this side of the family would have been here at all.
exactly.
So it's just, yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I don't want to keep you too long, but I want to know one thing because I know, correct me if I'm wrong, that you saw James Cameron's movie just once.
Yes, I have only watched it once. I watched it because I wanted to see how it went, and the actual design and the film itself is amazing. The actual quality of the production. I get frustrated with the Jack and Rose, but I do understand that it's Hollywood, and I do understand that it's. And I've said before, if it wasn't for the film, there wouldn't have been so much of a new generation of people coming forward. But what we need to do then is to educate the next generation that the film is not the be all and end all. You
That's
know.
how I got into Titanic.
Yes, exactly, and that's the point. And I think there's a huge amount of people that have been brought in because of the film. And so I don't play it down too hard. And it's not that I wouldn't necessarily watch it again. I have to admit I prefer the Night to Remember, though they make Lightoller a bit too much of a hero. But on the whole, I think I enjoy that film.
Yeah, that's more historically accurate than any
Yeah.
other movie. So I feel you on that one, even if I'm a huge fan of the Cameron's
Yes.
movie, because
And
that's
I will
how everything
say
started
on my
with.
Instagram, I will put Titanic film things on there. It's not that I'm anti-film. It's just I think it's just the little bits that grind them a little bit, but on the whole, I wouldn't knock it that hard. But
Such an amazing story, Simon, you told us. Thank you very much. And mm, can you tell us if you have any Instagram, social media?
right, well, I'm not sure whether this will work or not. I have got this, so I
Okay.
don't know whether if I hold that there for a minute or two, just a minute
Try.
or
I
two,
think it'll work.
it may work. Someone pauses it, they might be able to get it, but it is
Yeah.
just Titanic
Memorabilia.
so it's quite easy and straightforward.
I'll put all the links in the video, so
Yeah,
they'll find
brilliant.
you.
Yeah, and don't forget you can get the book.
Oh yeah. I'm getting one, so maybe
So,
we'll
yeah,
translate it in Italian. I'll do the
yeah,
job for you.
that would be fantastic, wouldn't it? Would be good.
Yeah. So Simon, thank you so much.
No, it's been lovely. It's been really good.
I've been like captured by everything you told us, and it's been nice to actually know your great-grandfather's story better from someone who's actually involved in the story. And I hope people understand that you don't judge a book from its cover, you know?
No.
So thank you very much. I hope I get to meet you when I get to London, or
Oh, I hope so. Yeah, we'll have to try and work out something.
it will be amazing. And I don't know if you want to add something else. I think we're done.
No, that's brilliant. I think just everybody that's listening to this, whether it's in English or whether it's been translated, just keep going. Enjoy the Titanic. Enjoy the stories. You know, it's a heart thing, and then just get into the story, and it'll grab you.
Thank you very much, Simon.
E questa ragazzi era la testimonianza, anzi il racconto di Simon Mathurst riguardo il suo bisnonno Robert Hitchens. Una storia a tratti assurda. Solamente il fatto che lui abbia cominciato a collezionare oggetti del Titanic a soli 20 anni, senza sapere di avere una connessione così forte con questa nave, la trovo veramente una cosa pazzesca. E spero soprattutto che abbiate potuto imparare e conoscere meglio la storia di Robert Hitchens e sul come sia importantissimo non passare giudizi solamente alle prime impressioni date da articoli di giornale o a volte anche i film. Fatemi sapere come al solito cosa ne pensate nei commenti e rimanete sintonizzati perché di ospiti ce ne saranno veramente tanti. Io come al solito vi ringrazio e ci vediamo al prossimo video sempre qui su Curiositanic.